Here is Van Dieman's Pixie Parasols. This is a very pale turquoise, much lighter than I had really expected when looking at the swatch. This gives a fairly consistent tone as paper changes within, some reason. It does shade some, but not as any kind of a standout quality. The standout quality in this is its name. On non-fountain pen friendly paper, it generally performs fine, but it must be noted that this being so pale, I was able to see deep into the page, showing that it does have some aggressive nature. I do love it when inks have cool names, and this is a really cool name. However, I find the tone too light for me, myself. So I'm not going for a bottle or even another sample.
The pen for today is a Kaweco 475. And now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how we got there by looking at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Here we get that very, very light turquoise, and I'm hoping it shows up better on camera. I'm looking up at my camera and I can barely see it there. We'll see what happens in the edit. It does not feather, does not spread. It does shade. Thankfully, obviously, I still can read what's there. Not hugely as a problem. When I look at obviously, I can see the shading that's going on where the O has lighter and darker tones in it. Goes darker into the B, but the VIOUS are all very light, where the LY at the end are the darker tone of what's happening. And considering that's the darker tone, that's where I'm just not as happy with this ink. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Van Dieman's makes more than just this one ink. So let's take a look at a few other inks from Van Dieman's.
Here is Van Dieman's Golden Nugget Pumpkin. Here is Van Dieman's Eggplant. Here is Van Dieman's Black Truffle. Here is Van Dieman's Sweetheart Cherry.
The second writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter notebook.
Here we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread. It does shade, but nowhere near as good as it did on the Clairfontaine. Typically, what you're going to see is typically right here on the second line. Light tone all the way through, very light, with only little spots that are slightly darker, like the Y at the end or the downstroke of that T, but for the most part, very light, losing the story to how light this is. Looking at the back of the page, to no surprise, there's no bleeding and no ghosting because of how light this ink is.
There's a lot to be learned by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is done the way it's supposed to be done. A line of ink is put down to immediately put into water to show the separation of those colors making the ink. Now the one on the right is marked with a D. This is allowed to dry for 10 minutes before it's put into water. The third writing sample is done in a national brand Steno notebook.
Here we can see that the tone is lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Also, it is much more green on here than it was on that very white Clairfontaine, showing that this ink is translucent. It is affected by the tone of the paper underneath. Not a problem, just be aware. There's no feather, there is no spread, there is some shading going on just to get rid of any kind of confusion when we look at confusion on the third line, where the con is darker. Keep some of that dark at the beginning of the F, but during the F, it transitions lighter till it gets to the SION at the end that it darkens some. Looking at the back of the page, with this being such a light ink, I do feel it necessary to point out those spots where it did get darker or deeper into the page. There's no real ghosting, which isn't a problem. These did not bleed through touching the page underneath. These would not stop somebody from writing on the back of the page, but it just does show that the ink gets deeper.
Resistance tests are done to see how well this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. Now, this smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. In the upper left, you can see where there is highlighter. In the upper right, that is pen flush. The lower left has a 1/3 bleach solution, and the lower right has plain old water. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Here we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread. It does shade just as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. It does not stand out against that quad rule. It's really, you have to look for it to try to read it underneath the quad rule, making this not a good ink to use if this is the type of paper that you go for. I believe it would generally be just a loss of your important notes. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at a few more teal or turquoise inks.
Here is Blackstone Blue Gum. Here is Geherban Diablo Menthe. Here is Kaweco Paradise Blue. Here is KWZ Turquoise.
All of the inks that you just saw have a review here on the channel. Now, the next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Here we can see that the tone is a little bit lighter and flatter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Very normal for this paper to do that. So that in itself is not a problem. It does not feather. It does not spread. It does shade just as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. Really something that was surprising here. The biggest issue I run into is it is hiding behind the quad rule. If you're a student using this, I think you're doing yourself a real injustice taking important lab notes with this ink on this paper. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
While it's nice to see inks that are in the same color family, I prefer to find inks that complement the color on the page.
Here is Dieman Coral. Here is Noodler's Purple Wampum.
Here is Sailor Studio 027.
Here is KWZ Raspberry.
The best way you can support this or any channel that you like watching is to alert the retailer of where you saw the product at time of purchase. Now, the last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Here we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather. It does have a little bit of spread. It even has a little bit of shading. I think this is generally too light for a lot of writing. However, if you were using this as a second tone on the page, I think this could be a good option. It's not horrible. It's just drawing slight attention to an area, not being overbearing in its opinions. Looking at the back of the page, there is a fair amount of ghosting, or more specifically, not ghosting. It's not doing that. It's getting very deep into the paper. A lot. Now, I do think with this being light, if it was doing this on both sides, it might make it quite a bit harder to read if this was the primary ink that you were using. So be warned. You have been warned.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
My vintage Kaweco 475 has a wet flex nib, and it gives a pale turquoise with a spattering of shading. Off camera, I tried this in a wet fine just to see if it got a little darker in tone, and it didn't. What you see is what you're going to get. I feel the only way to go here is with a wet pen in a fine or maybe even a stub if it is a color that you really like. I think you need to really consider your usage for this, though. Maybe not whole pages, but use it to add to the pages that you've written.